Hi, everyone. So I know a few of us are still taking our seats, but I think we should get started. We're very lucky to have with us today award-winning writer and Los Angeles Noir editor Denise Hamilton. Denise writes the nationally best-selling Eve Diamond crime novels featuring a reporter who solves murders in contemporary multicultural Los Angeles. Her books have been shortlisted for the Edgar, McCavity, Anthony, and Willa Cather Awards, along with being finalists for the prestigious Creasy Dagger Award. Her books have also been recognized as the best books of mystery by the LA Times, USA Today, and the Southern California booksellers. Denise is also an award-winning journalist who, during her 10 years on staff at the LA Times, covered the fall of communism in Eastern Europe and the breakup of the Soviet Union and youth movements in Japan. But the bulk of her Times career was spent in the suburbs of Los Angeles, where she covered the city's multicultural communities that feature prominently in her series. She is a recipient of many grants and fellowships and is a Fulbright scholar. So please join me today in welcoming Denise Hamilton, who's not only a resident of LA, but of our very own city of Glendale and a friend of GCC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lara, and thanks to everyone who came out today, and thank you to Glendale Community College for inviting me to speak here and for choosing the Los Angeles Noir Anthology as your one college, one book read. I want to talk a little bit about how I came to be standing here before you today. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley. My mother was a French immigrant. We spoke French at home. I don't really know when I learned English, but it was just kind of one of those things I picked up. When I went to college, I didn't know what I wanted to do, probably like some of you. I decided to major in business because I thought, well, the world can always use a business person, and I can always find a job. But really, my heart was always in writing. When I was a kid, I was a huge reader and a huge writer. And I was that weird kid sitting at the lunch tables during recess with her nose buried in a book. I read a lot. I wrote stories about my dog, about finding Atlantis, about traveling to Mars. But it never occurred to me that I could make a living as a writer because I didn't know any writers. I had no role models. And writers didn't really go on tour. There weren't that many young adult writers the way there are now. This was way before J.K. Rowling. So anyway, I majored in business, but I quickly realized that wasn't for me, so I decided to go back to school and get a master's in journalism. Because someone told me about this neat profession where you could get paid to be nosy and ask questions and then write stories. And to me, that's what I kind of wanted to do and would have probably done for free. So it was when I was at Cal State Northridge, which for any of you thinking of going into radio, TV, or print journalism, they have a wonderful program, really strong and very good connections to the industry. And because of that, I was able one summer to get a summer internship at the LA Times. The LA Times had a big bureau in the San Fernando Valley. And because I was young and very intimidated and really rather terrorized to be in a newsroom and actually have to write a story a day on deadline, I did everything they asked me. When they rewrote my stories from top to bottom, I said, oh, that reads much better. Thank you for rewriting it. And I realized that some of the mainstream, the more experienced journalists who worked at the LA Times would argue with the editors about every single word. And so the editors liked me because I was young and pliable, and they knew they could send me out and I would come back and write a story. Because really, print journalism is very much who, what, when, where, why, and then goodbye. I was at the LA Times for 10 years. They finally hired me after 3 years of being a temporary employee and an intern. And I think that for me at least, 85% of the reason that I got hired permanently at the LA Times was because I was there. because I was a known quantity. They had worked with me for 3 years. They knew my writing. I'm sure they had a lot of really great applications from all over the country, but ultimately they knew my personality and I was there, and it was really easy for them to hire me. So bear that in mind as you go about getting internships and doing temp jobs and everything. At any rate, I was a reporter for 10 years at the LA Times, and during that time, I interviewed thousands of people. I wrote thousands of stories. I interviewed millionaires, mayors, the president, and as well as people living in tents in the LA River and bathing in the water of the LA River. After 10 years as a reporter, I started to get the itch to write in a different way than journalism allowed. I had all these voices talking in my head, all these people I had met, all these incredible stories, all these murder cases, because often I would get sent to sit in on a murder trial and write about that, or I would get sent out to interview the cops when there was a homicide. And I started wanting to tell different stories in a way than that daily journalism allowed. And eventually I started noodling around with a story that was very much inspired by one of the newspaper stories I did for the LA Times. And it was about Asian immigrant kids who live by themselves in these big mansions in the San Gabriel Valley, in places like San Marino and Walnut and Hacienda Heights. And often their parents are living in Taiwan or Hong Kong, or they're in mainland China where they're kind of overseeing family businesses and factories, and the kids are kind of growing up alone with a mom, with a housekeeper. And when I turned this story into the LA Times, they thought I had made it up, my editors, because they just thought it was too bizarre. But I was able to show them that indeed, no, this is going on, and there's probably about 60,000 of these kids in the US today. I found an academic research paper that estimated this. And you know, my feeling as a reporter at the LA Times was always, why would anyone in LA ever need to make anything up? All you have to do is go out and talk to people, and you will find the most surreal, bizarre, noir, crazy, tragic, funny, blackly humorous stories that you can imagine. So you don't need to make it up. Just go out and talk to people. And I did that for 10 years. And sometimes I felt very much like a character in a Raymond Chandler novel, because reporters are kind of gumshoes. We're kind of like private eyes. We go talk to somebody, and somebody gives us a piece of information, and then we go talk to somebody else, and we get another piece of information. And sometimes we find witnesses that the police have failed to interview. Sometimes people who witness crimes are criminals themselves and don't want to talk to the police, but they'll talk to me because I'm just a woman with a notepad. And if they don't give me their name and I don't ask, they'll tell me what they saw. So anyway, I think it was very good grounding to eventually start writing crime fiction. And so I have 6 books, 6 crime novels that I have written. And they are all, 5 of them are contemporary. They're in a series, and they feature a young woman reporter, surprise, who solves crimes. And I've always lived on the east side of town, so my books take place in the San Gabriel Valley, in Silver Lake. There are even a few scenes in Glendale, Pasadena. And I really want to write about the people who I live around, and it's not the rich, white West Siders. There's enough novels and enough movies that deal with those communities. I want to write about the rich diversity of LA, which I think actually makes it a very interesting place to be today. Now, after I had written these 6 books, I got a call from a different publisher who said, would you be willing to edit and put together a short story collection that we would call Los Angeles Noir? And I did a little research and said, okay, I'll do that. And that is the book that Glendale College has picked for the One City, One Book. Now, in order to be able to edit and what I call kind of curate a collection, assign stories, talk to writers about what kind of story you're going to write. Because I know that they're going to ask me, well, what is noir? And wait a minute, isn't noir like the old Humphrey Bogart movies where he's wearing a trench coat and he's a detective with an office on Hollywood Boulevard and he drinks too much whiskey? So I thought I'm going to have to be able to talk to them about what noir is and how I see it being relevant today, because the editors did not want kind of historic stories. They wanted stories set in the 21st century. And each story, of course, is set in a different neighborhood of LA. So I had to go back and determine for myself what is noir literature, and what is noir, film noir. Noir, of course, just means black in French. LA noir just means kind of like dark tales from LA. Noir, dark. Film noir was a term that the French actually coined. The French in the 50s put together this magazine called Cahiers du Cinéma, and they were just in love with the old gangster movies, the old Hollywood gangster movies and westerns, and they studied them, and they really treated them as kind of these academic, important movies. And so that is where the term noir comes from. But then I thought, well, when did noir literature start in Los Angeles? Did it start in Los Angeles or did it start elsewhere? And so I went back and I looked at all the literature of Los Angeles. And really, LA is an incredibly young city compared to places like New York and Philadelphia, even Washington, D.C., Boston. There were very few LA stories prior to the 1920s. We have like kind of romanticized versions of LA and Southern California, stories like novels like Ramona, which are about Native Americans and the early settlers to California. But when did the first kind of noir literature, gangster stories, detective fiction start in LA? Really not until the 1920s, the late 1920s. And noir writing in LA and the popularity of crime and detective fiction in LA really, I think, grew out of Prohibition. Prohibition was when alcohol was made illegal in this country. For 15 years, almost 15 years, from 1920 to 1933. And you know what? A lot of people like to drink, and they weren't going to stop drinking just because it was illegal. What it did was it created this whole kind of criminal enterprise where you had rum runners bringing in alcohol from Cuba, you had gangsters involved, you had speakeasies, and everybody went to speakeasies, and everybody drank the bathtub gin. And of course, the cops had to be on the take because you couldn't bring in all this alcohol and have all these speakeasies and nightclubs without the cops being involved and being paid off. So it was a time when official corruption in Los Angeles and really throughout the country was rather sanctioned. And there was kind of this wink-wink attitude toward something that was illegal. And so you had the beginnings of all the elements of noir. You had crooked cops, you had gangsters, you had femme fatales, you had flappers, you had the easing of morality with the 1920s, the Jazz Age. And so this is where we first start seeing crime short stories appearing in Los Angeles. And really, LA is the epicenter of noir fiction. And why is that? Well, I think there are a lot of reasons. First, LA is so entrenched with Hollywood. Hollywood is the place where everyone comes to reinvent themselves. Everyone thinks they're going to make it big here. The stakes are so high. There's the artifice versus reality. Everyone is pretending to be somebody they're not. This is great grounds for fiction. There's also the physical beauty of Los Angeles and Southern California. And it's a place where it's a kind of a paradise. And the people who first came to Los Angeles, who fled the Midwest, who fled the snowy winters in the East Coast, they thought that they had come to paradise. They could walk outside in a t-shirt in winter. They could pick oranges off the tree. They were beautiful. There was the bougainvillea, the birds of paradise. They could look out and see the snowy white sands of the endless beaches. There were the mountain peaks filled with snow. There was the beauty of the landscape. There was the beauty of the people, because everyone who came here was an ex-beauty queen, wanted to make it in the movies, was a handsome cowboy. LA is really where we run out of confident. People come here out of continent. People came from all over the world, all over the country. They wanted to remake themselves. They wanted to make it big in Hollywood, okay? And there was the beauty, there was the aspiration, and there was the artifice versus the reality. So again, this is really a great ground for fiction, for crime fiction. And there were some very famous magazines around this time in the 1920s and 30s, such as Black Mask magazine. And this is where authors were first starting to submit crime short stories. And Raymond Chandler was one of the early writers, contributors to Black Mask. There was also a guy named Paul Kane. Paul Kane was probably the first guy who wrote noir fiction in Los Angeles. He was a screenwriter and he wrote short stories. They were very much about gangsters and bad guys and crooked cops, and they moved at an incredible velocity. And everyone in them swore and talked in slang. And it was a shock to the literary establishment of Los Angeles because he was writing the way people talked in the street. It wasn't the highfalutin parlor language that literature was supposed to embrace. Raymond Chandler, when he would turn in his manuscripts, the editors in New York would try to pretty up the language. Say, well, you can't say this is slang. And he would write letters and say, when I split an infinitive, I damn well want it to stay split. And I write the way a Swiss waiter would talk, because that is the language of the streets. Now, we don't really have Swiss waiters anymore, but what he was saying is, I write like a man of the people. And this was a great shock to the establishment. And the reviews at the time of Raymond Chandler's novels and short stories, James M. Cain, who wrote Double Indemnity, The Postman Always Rings Twice, Mildred Pierce, which has scenes that are set in Glendale, the critics were very harsh on them, and they said, they're showing the ugly parts of human society. Why should we want to read that? Well, we want to read about that for the same reasons that we slow down and look at the car crash on the side of the freeway. We know we shouldn't look. We know we're going to slow everyone down. It's appalling. It's horrible. We can't look. We can't not look. Oh my God, thank God it's not me. All right, so one of the appeals of noir is that these are bad people doing bad things. And people are always saying to me, well, how would you define noir? What is the essence of noir? I see it as a very elastic topic, but if you want a definition, it is someone who has a choice, and they can go down the right path or the wrong path. And they take a step down the wrong path, and they think, I'm just going to take this one step. I'm just going to take this bag of money that is not mine. I am just going to sleep with this woman who is not my wife. I'm just going to kill this one person so that I can take the money. And they know they shouldn't do that, but they rationalize to themselves why they're going to get away with it, because they're so smart, because they're so cocky, because they're only doing it once. And stepping off the proper track means that they're going to get further enmeshed, and they take one step, and then they have to take another step, and then they have to take another step, and it's this downward spiral that the characters of noir engage in. And we as the reader know that things are going to end badly, but the narrator or the characters in the noir story or novel don't. They think they're going to get away with it. Well, I just have to kill these 3 last people who saw what happened, and then me and the girl are going to get away. Well, of course, it never ends up working out that way. But I have to tell you, as someone who writes crime fiction, it is a lot of fun to write bad guys and bad girls, femme fatales. When I was calling authors and saying, would you want to write a short story for a collection called Los Angeles Noir, I didn't want to have just crime writers, and I didn't want to just have white guys. which are the traditional writers of noir. I wanted writers who could really show the diversity of Los Angeles at every level. And so there are certainly some detective stories in Los Angeles noir. There are also some very literary writers who are writing crime stories. And they said to me, Susan Straight and Janet Fitch are two examples of more literary authors. Janet Fitch wrote White Oleander, which became a movie with Michelle Pfeiffer. It was also an Oprah pick. Susan Straight was a finalist for the National Book Award. She writes literary novels that are set in Riverside, which she calls Rio Seco, but she is really a chronicler of Southern California. So when I contacted these literary writers and I said, would you write a short story for this collection called LA Noir? They said to me, you mean I get to kill someone? I said, yes, if you can do it in 15 pages or less, because we cannot have 4-page descriptions of a leaf falling from a tree. This is noir and it needs to move fast. And so you do it in 15 pages and you pick a neighborhood that you want to write about. And they all picked, I was really shocked. They were delighted, especially these literary writers, were delighted to get down and dirty and write a crime short story with bad people doing bad things. The other thing that interested me with the collection is not everyone wanted to pick the neighborhoods like Hollywood, Santa Monica, downtown. Michael Conley, who's a big crime writer, said to me, I want to set my story along Mulholland Drive. Is that okay? Is that a neighborhood? And I said, well, yeah, because I think that when we say the words Mulholland Drive, everybody knows what we're talking about. Everyone, even if you've never driven Mulholland Drive, you've seen it in movies, or you've seen it on some video game where you're racing a car down Mulholland Drive. Mulholland Drive is wealthy. It's a lot of trees. It's treacherous curves. Another short story by Jim Pascoe is set along the LA River. Again, not a neighborhood per se, unless you're homeless or a bird, but great place to dump a body, right? The LA River. Most people who are not from LA don't even realize we have a river here because it's kind of like paved in concrete. Another author wanted to set a short story in Commerce. And I said to him immediately, yes, because I knew no one else was going to propose to set a short story in Commerce. Most of us have never even been to Commerce unless it's to go to the casino there. I drive by it all the time on I-5. But I thought, I want this LA Noir collection to show people and readers neighborhoods in LA that maybe they've never been to. Slices of life, neighborhoods, people, communities that they might not be familiar with. That was my goal. I also, before I started talking to authors about what stories they should write for me for LA Noir, I saw all of the movies, the traditional noir movies, over again. And I'm talking about movies like Double Indemnity, Postman Always Rings Twice, Maltese Falcon, Sunset Boulevard. And I reread a lot of the novels of classic noir. And when I talked to the authors, I said, okay, we don't want a rehash of the detective in the trench coat. You need to find some new way to channel Raymond Chandler and James M. Cain in the 21st century. If Raymond Chandler were writing today, what would his characters be like? Where would he set his short stories? And what would be the mood? Because to me, LA is more noir today than it ever has been. It used to be that people came from all over the country to make it in Hollywood, to reinvent themselves. Now they come from all over the world. LA has Little Yerevan, Little Armenia, Thai Town. Monterey Park is like the new middle-class Chinatown. Little Saigon, Little Guatemala, you name it, we've got it here. And I think that, there are so many more layers today to write about. The other thing is the neighborhoods that exist today, many of them were orange groves and bean fields in the 40s when Chandler was writing. And there were those oil derricks, that pumped the oil. Every once in a while you can still see one in Los Angeles, but they're very rare now. But today I think a lot of the action is taking place behind gated communities, in ethnic neighborhoods. My short story, Midnight in Silicon Alley, is kind of a classic femme fatale story, and yet all I had to do was move it into the immigrant Chinese community and set it in the San Gabriel Valley, and it became completely new. The story was actually inspired by a story that I covered at the LA Times and a story that people told me about. LA is just I think LA is really the ultimate femme fatale. And I think for every writer who is in the anthology, LA is a muse, an inspiration, a femme fatale. LA is bedeviling, puzzling, entrancing. I kind of liken LA sometimes to a bad boyfriend that I know is no good for me, and I've been trying to leave him for years, and just when I'm ready to move on, he woos me back with promises. It's going to be better this time. The traffic's not going to be as bad. The helicopters aren't going to be circling overhead at midnight. And, it is true that I think for all of us writers who write crime fiction about LA, we're trying to figure it out. We're trying to puzzle it out. Writers who wrote noir, especially in Los Angeles, loved the idea that crime fiction and noir allowed you to write about all the different strata of society. It allowed you to write about official corruption. For me, as a reporter turned novelist, it was a great opportunity to take some of the stories that people had told me that I knew were true, but we couldn't prove it, about the corrupt city council member who everyone knew he was a cokehead, but until he got caught with crack cocaine in the projects of East LA late at night, nobody could write that story because he kept saying, I'm clean. And of course, when he got caught with the crack cocaine, he said, well, I'm just visiting my constituents. The cops did not buy it. But so there is a lot of corruption. We know there are corrupt cops. We know there are corrupt city officials. Look at this scandal now with the city of Bell in southeast LA County. But often you cannot prove it. So as a journalist, you cannot write that story. The beauty of fiction is you can make it up. You can create the bad guys, good guys, and everything in between. And you can show official corruption and how it works. Noir is usually pretty cynical, that bad things happen to bad people, but bad things happen to good people too. Noir is also extremely romantic. Despite the corruption, despite the grittiness, there's always glamour, there's always money, there's always speakeasies, and a femme fatale dressed in some slinky outfit who's tempting some guy into his doom. LA in the 40s really reflected what you see in the movies and what you read in the books. There was so much official corruption in Los Angeles in 1949 that the head of the LAPD was forced to resign because he was about to be indicted. The number 2 guy who stepped up to run the LAPD was indicted 2 months later. Half the Hollywood Vice squad was on the take. You could not get a job in Hollywood Vice. There was such a long waiting list because they knew that you get a job there and you're getting paid off by all the gangsters. 1940s LA was a very noir place also because there was a guy named Mickey Cohen who was running. He was called the King of the Sunset Strip. He controlled all the rackets in Los Angeles. There were shootouts at nightclubs at 4 in the morning. He lived in Brentwood. There were bombs placed under his car. He had what was called a haberdashery, which is like a men's clothing store, that was a front for all his mobster activities. And he had grown up in Boyle Heights in East LA, just kind of east of downtown. Back when it wasn't necessarily a Latino neighborhood, it was a very, very ethnically diverse neighborhood. Japanese, Slavic, Jewish, Italian, and everything in between. And Mickey Cohen grew up there with a guy who, when Mickey Cohen became the head gangster in LA, this guy became the head sheriff, the LA County Sheriff. His name was Eugene Biscayous, and he and Mickey Cohen, the head gangster, were like this, because they were childhood friends. And so Mickey Cohen set up his haberdashery literally like 10 feet outside of the LA City border in LA County, unincorporated territory, in land that is today West Hollywood, because he also paid off the LAPD, but he was childhood friends with the LA sheriff, so he knew that the sheriff had his back. So it was an incredibly different era than it is today. The gangsters dated movie stars. Lana Turner was married to one of Mickey Cohen's henchmen, a guy named Johnny Stompanato, who was stabbed to death by Lana Turner's 14-year-old daughter. It was an era when if there was if there was somebody killed in a movie star home, the movie star would call. Jean Harlow's husband was killed in the 1930s, shot to death. And the first thing she did was not call 911 or the cops. She called the studio and she said, "There's been an accident and my husband's been shot and he's dead." And the studio people immediately called the police and said, "There's been an accident. Let us go in and sanitize it, and you guys can come in a couple hours from now." And the cop said, "Okay." So it was a very different time. But if everyone is complicit, if everyone's drinking prohibition booze, if everyone's going to speakeasies, if everyone's putting bets on the horses, if everyone is hobnobbing with the gangsters, if everyone is complicit, then who is truly bad? It kind of created this very gray morality in traditional noir. Getting back to the history of noir for a little bit, so that we had Prohibition, which was when gangsters became sexy and speakeasies. Then the Great Depression hit, and it was really the first time that people realized the government is not going to bail us out. There is no money. The banks have failed. Think of the Jodes. Think of the Dust Bowl. And this was a time when people realized we are on our own. The government is corrupt. The cops are corrupt. This was this kind of a sentiment and a feeling that really fed classic noir. There is a wonderful novel that came out in 1935 called They Shoot Horses, Don't They? It's only 132 pages. They made a movie out of it with Jane Fonda. It is so bleak, it is so modern, it is so noir, it is so dark. I highly recommend it. Some of the issues it deals with are abortion, adultery, alcoholism, gigolos, murder. It's an epitome of a noir story. And it takes place along the Santa Monica Pier during a dance marathon, which is basically when you dance until you drop. And the last people who are left dancing are the winners. They get a 5-minute break every hour. And these were desperate people who signed up for this, people who had no money, who had tuberculosis. They were all hoping to win the dance marathon. 132 pages, absolutely devastating, wonderful noir novel. Hollywood had not really made movies yet of all the wonderful authors who wrote crime detective fiction, such as Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, and James M. Cain yet. But they were going to. They were aware that this was sexy and interesting and that people would pay to see it. One of the other things that helped kind of create the noir vibe, and when we think noir, we think of the rain pattering on the walls, we think of the dim lighting, the headlights shining through the Venetian blinds, the dimmed interior, the claustrophobic spaces, the kind of paranoid stories. One of the things that really influenced the look of films and film noirs at the time was the rise of Hitler in Nazi Germany. A lot of the intellectuals who were creative artists, directors, screenwriters, novelists, set designers, they were either intellectuals, they were Jews, they were liberals, they had to flee. Because they would have been killed, or they realized that they did not want to live in occupied Europe with Hitler on charge. So they came to Los Angeles, and they really brought this kind of avant-garde sensibility and look to the movies, and a very kind of sophisticated aesthetic. They were also very much influenced by the visual artistic movement of German Expressionism. So they brought all of this into the movies. Directors like Billy Wilder, Fritz Lang, Erich von Stroheim, Kurt Weill, Ernest Lubitsch, Thomas Mann, the author, Otto Preminger, on and on. They really helped, I think, develop noir. Then we finally get into World War II with Pearl Harbor. Okay, all of a sudden Hollywood has a real problem. All the wood, all the electricity, and all the gasoline is rationed. It's all going to the war effort. Hollywood all of a sudden can't do Gone with the Wind anymore. They can't go on expensive locations. And they can't build many sets the way they're used to, because there isn't any money, there isn't any wood, they can't light the sets. So what they did was they created more interior sets, They lit them very poorly so that they could just change one or two things, and we, as the viewer of the movie, would think it was a whole different set. But really what they did was dim the lights so no one would know that it was the same set. And again, the shortage of petrol, of electricity, meant that Hollywood had to improvise. So the big budgets are scaled back, the look of the movies change completely. Raymond Chandler eventually co-wrote the screenplay to Double Indemnity. There was this cross-pollination between the authors and the films, the novels and the films. So that today when we think of like noir literature or film noir, it's very, very hard, I think, for most of us to separate the visuals from the words, because Humphrey Bogart is so entrenched in our minds as Philip Marlowe and as that kind of classic, iconic detective. After World War II, all of a sudden, we've won World War II, isn't this wonderful? Okay, but now we're all going to die in an atomic blast. There was a disillusionment that set in. There was a recession worldwide. Things are not looking so good anymore in Hollywood, and people are depressed. They're realizing again that life isn't so good. This was kind of the classic period of film noir, B-movies, people lusting after, the suburban lifestyle and the trophy wife, and wanting material things and realizing not everyone's going to get it. Again, great topics for noir, fiction and movies. The other thing that happened was after World War II, there were a lot of independent movie studios that sprang up. All of a sudden, actors were not tied to the studios, and screenwriters could write for whoever they wanted, and some of the actors and some of the producers and directors started their own little movie companies. And they are the people who made the B movies that we think of today as classic noir. I just saw one yesterday that's going to be released on DVD. It's called The Prowler. It was filmed in 17 days. It had really great stars, but the script was banged out, and it was shot in Hollywood and partially in the Mojave Desert on a very small budget. I think it was like $400,000 for everything. And they were able to get big stars, but they were B movies. They were not like your big epics. But because of that, because they were B movies, they weren't like the big epics like Gone with the Wind. They weren't the big, Singing in the Rain. They were kind of like the second build movie on the feature set. So the studios who did these movies were often drawn to noir material. Crooked cops, femme fatales, that kind of thing. At the same time in Hollywood, there was a lot of, maybe some of you have heard of the communist witch trials, HUAC. A lot of people in Hollywood were accused of being communists. There was a lot of fear. There were people, directors and actors being subpoenaed. Some of them had to flee the country. Really some wonderful actors and Hollywood people, and it created this kind of very grim paranoia on top of the atomic bomb and on top of the Cold War. People were afraid, and again, that paranoia I think is reflected in the movies of the time, the novels, the stories. I do want to mention the fact that classic noir was really, in literature and in film, was really a man's world, and it really was a white man's world. If there was any genre that kind of excluded women, that was known for kind of sexism, it really was noir, where the women were kind of relegated to roles of femme fatales, or they were the good little girl who needs to be saved. And in some of the movies and books, the good little girl at the end is kind of revealed as the femme fatale. But this was an era where women were not always portrayed in a three-dimensional way. Think of Double Indemnity with Barbara Stanwyck and Fred McMurray. And when she opens the door to Fred McMurray and she's got this white gown on and she's gorgeous, you know that Fred McMurray's going to end up killing her husband to collect the insurance, the double indemnity clause. There were a few women, though, who wrote wonderful noir fiction and screenplays at the time. Unfortunately, they're not as well known as the guys, but I just did want to mention them. Some of them are in LA Noir too, the second collection that I put together. There was a woman named Lee Brackett, who wrote crime fiction in the 40s for Black Mask magazine. And this was a time, before the internet, where Lee Brackett would write her story and mail it off to Black Mask magazine, and they liked it and they would publish it. And I think that because she spelled her name Leigh, people just assumed she was a man, because women were not thought to be able to write noir. Oh, women's minds don't work in those dark, nasty ways. It's not ladylike to write noir. But she was a real dame. And Howard Hawks, the Hollywood director, he really liked Lee Brackett's short stories. So he told his secretary one day, he said, "Get me that guy Lee Brackett on the phone. I want Lee Brackett to come in here, and I want him to write the screenplay to one of the Raymond Chandler movies, one of the Raymond Chandler books." And 2 weeks later, in walks this young woman who looks like Lauren Bacall, and she says to the director, "Hi, I'm Lee Brackett." And Howard Hawks almost fell off his chair because he was expecting it to be a man. Anyway, Lee Brackett ended up writing the screenplay for this Raymond Chandler movie. Screenplay. She also wrote novels set in the crime fiction world genre. She also wrote science fiction. She wrote many more screenplays. She had a 50-year career writing screenplays and novels and short stories. She ended her career 50 years later by co-writing the screenplay to The Empire Strikes Back for George Lucas. So she had an amazing career at a time when women really did not make it very far in screenwriting, and in two genres that were very dominated by men. Because if there's one genre that was even more male-dominated than crime fiction and noir, it was science fiction. There aren't that many women who wrote science fiction back then. Another woman who wrote in the 40s, who's absolutely wonderful, is Dorothy B. Hughes. She wrote a novel called In a Lonely Place that was published in 1949, and it was told from the first-person perspective of a male serial killer. And it was made into a movie with Humphrey Bogart, which you can rent. What was amazing was she wrote about a serial killer before there was a term for serial killers, and she chose to make her main character a guy and write from the perspective of a man. Her book is kind of in and out of print. I think it's published by a feminist press, but I think it should be right up there with Raymond Chandler and James M. Cain and all the big boys, because she's wonderful. Ross MacDonald was a very well-known noir crime writer too, in the 50s and in the 60s. And he's pretty well known and established in the pantheon. But his wife was a woman named Margaret Millar, who also wrote devastatingly incisive crime fiction and psychological suspense. Again, she's not as well known as the guys. It's unfortunate, but I think that there has been a lot of sexism in noir. And unfortunately, I was unable to make the panel for the Femme Fatales last week because I really wanted to hear what everybody had to say. But I think that one of the things I was trying to redress in the anthology Los Angeles Noir was to find women who wrote hard-boiled crime fiction, or who wrote literary fiction that happened to be wonderfully written and had a murder in it. And I was very pleased when Susan Straight's very literary story, The Golden Gopher, won the Edgar Allan Poe Award. And that's one of the stories in Los Angeles Noir, because it kind of made me feel like, well, maybe people are a little tired of the detective, the kind of standard detective tropes, and they're just looking for good writing. And that's really what I was trying to do with Los Angeles Noir. Sure, we need the usual suspects. We need Michael Connelly, because he's a wonderful, mystery detective fiction writer, but I also wanted to kind of expand the envelope a little bit. The other thing I wanted to do was to really find authors who could reflect the cultural diversity of Los Angeles. And I think perhaps Hector talked last week, Hector Tobar, a little bit about his story. And his two cop characters, one is Armenian, American, and the other, I believe, is either Mexican American or Guatemalan American, and they're in East Hollywood. And of course, if you know East Hollywood, you know that those are two big communities there. I love that. I love that they're not the typical, like, Humphrey Bogart white guy, because I think that literature has got to start reflecting the diversity of Los Angeles, and hopefully some of you are going to be writing, the next generation's Raymond Chandler novels. All right, so in the 60s, noir really went away. People were not writing noir fiction. There were very few noir movies. The whole kind of hippie, revolution kind of brought that to a halt. However, luckily, nobody told a guy named Robert Towne. Robert Towne had long been fascinated by the history of LA, and real estate and water, how the people who ran LA were able to bring water to the city, which allowed for the development of the outlying areas, including the San Fernando Valley. And it was a tale of corruption and secrecy and fraud, Henry Mulholland. Anyway, so this guy, Robert Towne, wrote a script by the name of Chinatown. And it was made into a movie in 1974. And it is one of the best noir movies you will ever see. And it did not come out of a novel, but it was noir literature. He had the vision, he wrote the screenplay, and Roman Polanski directed the movie. But I have to give a lot of credit to Robert Towne for kind of bringing noir back. And in a way, I think what it proved is it never really went away. Because noir is all about the 7 deadly sins and breaking the 10 commandments and human frailty and crime. And we are endlessly fascinated by people who step over the line and walk onto the dark side. I think the next big development in noir, especially in Los Angeles, again, did not come from literature. It came from the movies again. And it came from a movie that came out in 1982 called Blade Runner. And you might argue and say, well, it was science fiction. Yes, it was science fiction. It came out of a novel by Philip K. Dick called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? But if you have seen Blade Runner, the Harrison Ford character, who is the Blade Runner, the guy the lone wolf detective, PI, who chases after the replicants who have escaped from the other planets and brings them back, he is the Philip Marlowe archetype of the lonely, romantic, crusty on the outside, a little soft on the inside detective. The white knight moving through this incredibly exotic third world Pacific Rim city of LA, which I never thought was actually that far into the future, because there are many parts of LA that look just like Blade Runner, both in 1982 and today. I think it has held up very well. So I think that the movie Blade Runner was very much a noir creation. And I think that, so today, when I was telling these authors, okay, I want you to write a noir short story, there needs to be a body, I said, channel the old movies, channel Double Indemnity, Sunset Boulevard, and they did. Janet Fitch's short story is very much a Sunset Boulevard short story, but instead of the Gloria Swanson character, who is the silent film star living in a mansion in Beverly Hills, isolated all by herself, and then the young actor comes into her life. Janet Fitch placed the story of the Sunset Boulevard story in Los Feliz, in the hills of Los Feliz, and had an aging 1970s TV star who is reclusive, and her beauty is fading, and her closets are full of gorgeous clothes, and she is kind of seduced by this young man who is trouble. Michael Conley's short story, Mulholland Dive, which is the first story in LA Noir, is very much a Double Indemnity short story, because the guy whose car goes out of control on Mulholland Drive, it turns out he has a double indemnity policy on his life insurance, which means I forget exactly what it means, but if they can prove that he wasn't murdered, then the payout is double what his life insurance policy is worth. So I think that, channeling the old stories but putting them in a new setting. For me, it was the idea of the femme fatale, but moving it into the Chinese community and being able to write about what life is like in the San Gabriel Valley today for people from that community. There was a short story that takes place in Hollywood in the Russian community, written by a Russian-American author. And I think that the idea is that noir is alive and well today. There's still crime, there are still femme fatales, people still murder and cheat and lie and are not who they seem. And there's something glamorous about reading about that. I like to say that mystery writers, crime writers, we're very well-adjusted people because all day long we poison and we stab and we shoot and we scheme to do away with our characters. And when we get up from the computer at the end of the day, we've worked it all out and we're very easygoing and happy and well-adjusted because we've worked everything out. Okay, so does anyone have any questions for me? Yes?
Could you please tell me your writing space? Where would you like to spend your time to write your novels?
Is the question, what is my writing space like? Where do I write my novels? Okay, I have a kind of a walk-in closet that's off my bedroom. And it's a little nook, and there is a window, and I have a computer there, and that's where I write. And I have 2 kids who go to school, and my writing day is very much bookmarked by when they leave and when they get back. So I write during the day when they're gone, because when they come home, it's like the Tasmanian devil whirling in a cloud of dust, and I have to take off the writer hat because I cannot concentrate when there's always some emergency. And I put on the mommy hat, and I wear the mommy hat till like at least 10 at night. So I have to be very disciplined because I work at home. No one's I'm not punching a clock, but I am punching the clock because if I don't turn in my next manuscript, I don't get my next advance, and my next book isn't going to come out, and no one's going to buy it, and I'm not going to get royalties. And so I do need to be disciplined. Any other questions? Yes.
Are any of these short stories ever like, or I can't even are they ever going to be made like some kind of like a movies or little like short? It kind of reminded me, I don't know if you remember, Steven Spielberg's Amazing Stories. A little short little, and when I was reading about this.
The question is, are any of the LA Noir short stories ever going to be made into movies? There has been talk about that. Nothing's been optioned by Hollywood yet. I think that one reason is that whoever optioned it or bought it would have to go to the 17 different authors and basically pay 17 different people and negotiate 17 different contracts, which is a little more difficult than dealing with one author who has, for instance, a series, like what's the vampire one? Yeah. No, not Twilight. No. The one that's on TV. True Blood, right? Yeah. See, that's based on a series by someone I know. I'm very happy that's been so successful for her. Because that was a woman who had 2 kids to put through college, and she wrote 2 books a year. She cranked those books out. And, if I can just say one thing about writing, and that is you cannot wait for the muse to strike. I think that a lot of people have the misconception that we writers, or screenwriters, or novelists, or whatever kind of writing we do, that we have to wait to be inspired. And let me tell you, the inspiration comes about 5 pages in. I sit down every day, whether I feel like it or not, and I write, and I put one word in front of the other, and I think, what is going to happen next? Raymond Chandler said, whenever you don't know what's going to happen next, have a guy with a gun walk into the room. And, since I write crime fiction, that's always a possibility, but you can't have that in every chapter. So I don't outline my novels. I don't know who the murderer is half the time. I write kind of very organically from chapter to chapter. And as I write, the characters develop, and their personalities and their motives and their secret connections that nobody knows, and who did what to whom and why that was hidden or buried 20 years ago, and it's all going to come bubbling up to the surface. But then if I say, aha, this person needs to be the murderer because they're the ones with the motive, then I have to twist it again and not pick that person, because if I figured that out, then you will too. And part of it is tricking you. Writing a crime novel or a crime story, it's all about misdirection. It's like magic. We're saying, here, look here, and here's where the stuff is happening. Here's where the pigeon is being pulled out. But we're saying, look over here, because we want to distract you into thinking, oh yeah, this is the killer, when really we're bringing up the killer from the rear here. And we're going to show him in the last chapter. Yes?
In your, the night in Silicon Valley, is the mole the uncle?
Is the mole the uncle in Midnight in Silicon Alley, which is my short story in Los Angeles Noir? No, I didn't mean him to be the uncle. That whole premise of those takeover robberies of the computer chip factories, that grew out of a story that I did as a journalist. And what was happening was I was talking to the FBI, and they have an Asian organized crime task force, and they said, well, all of these computer chip factories all up and down California are being hit by these very precise military-style robberies where they have a mole inside the factory, they know exactly what the layout is, and often they would actually go to the owner's house and kidnap their family, and then have the wife call up the husband at the office and say, honey, do what they say or they're going to kill the kids, you know? And I actually interviewed one of the criminals. It's a very interesting thing because I put the word out among my sources. And as reporters, you know, you always have sources. You have cops, you have defense attorneys, you have people who are a little shady. And I said, I need to interview one of these guys who's doing these crimes. And so I talked to a probation officer who said, okay, well, I've got this kid who's on probation. He says he knows about this, that he was a part of it, or he was in prison for a couple years because of this. He's willing to talk to you if you don't use his real name. And I said, okay. And then the guy said, okay, here's how it's going to work. You go down to Little Saigon in Orange County, and you wait in front of this like Vietnamese mall. And this red late model Japanese car is going to pull up, and you're going to get in the car. And he's going to drive around, and you can ask him anything you want, and he'll talk to you, but he's not going to tell you his name. And I thought, is this dangerous? And then but I just wanted that story so badly. And I did trust this probation guy. I said, okay, so I'm not putting myself in any danger. No, he's clean. He's okay now. So he drove around, and he was very twitchy, and he told me everything about how they would do it. And I got the feeling he wasn't quite as removed from his life of crime as his probation officer would have liked to think. So that's where the idea for that story came from. And that's why being a journalist or a reporter is such great training ground for writing fiction or writing crime fiction, because every day you get paid to go out and interview cops and criminals and bad guys and victims and, like I said, everybody from every walk of life in LA. And I think that because of that, I have a very noir vision of this city. I see it as very gritty, blackly humorous, dark, but also glamorous, But so that's a very long answer to your question, which is no, that wasn't the uncle. But I also did a story about those brothels, and I went on a raid with the cops, and that was just heartbreaking. That's all contained in my first novel, The Jasmine Trade. And I think that for me, part of writing these novels is a way to kind of document these crazy, crazy stories that I covered as a reporter that if I told you over the dinner table, you wouldn't believe it. But if I put it in a book, then it's fiction. And I do change everything. Like Savage Garden, which is another one of my books, was very much inspired by the murder of the lead singer for the band Los Lobos, his wife. Cesar Rosas, his wife was murdered about 10 years ago. And the guy confessed, and he was in prison, and I was supposed to go interview him as a young man that the band had tried to help. And the story was so bizarre that I just, what happened was that Cesar Rosas' wife had been adopted as a child, and she wanted to find her biological family, her birth family. So the band hired a detective and found that she had this half-brother who was had not been adopted, had been raised in a very bad situation, and had been basically in and out of prison for most of his life since he was about 13. So they knock on his door and say, congratulations, you're related to the biggest Latin rock band in the world. And you want a job, they'll give you a job, a place to live, you want to go to school. A year and a half later, he kills his half-sister. So if she had never gone to find her half-brother, It's like this Pandora's box. If she had never done that, she'd still be alive today. And I just thought, that just boggles my brain, you know, that here she was trying to get connected with her birth family, and she ends up murdered. So I moved all of that into the LA theater world. It starts on opening night of a play, and the lead actress doesn't show up, and I take it from there. So you can never take the real life story and just dump it into a novel, but you can certainly use it for inspiration and as, you know, kind of this emotional hook to write a book. Any other questions? Yes?
Has anyone ever created a map of real-life locations around the city where noir scenes were set to get organized? I don't know, a bike ride or something.
Has anyone ever created a map of scenes where noir, of locations where noir scenes were filmed? Well, it's funny you should ask that, because there is a group called esotouric.com, and they have these buses that they rent, and they sell tickets, and they go to various crime scenes. And like they have a Raymond Chandler tour, they have a Charles Bukowski tour, they have a Black Dahlia tour that I actually went on. And at first I thought, oh, maybe it's going to be hokey or titillating, sensationalist. They really did their research. They show, they have like a presentation where they show original newspaper articles, photos, coroner's reports, and they take you to what was the cornfield where the Black Dahlia's dismembered body was found in 1947, and now it's tract homes in the Crenshaw district. But you actually stand on the sidewalk of what was that field. So yes, it's I can give you the website afterwards. It's really interesting. Yes.
Roman's bookstore in Pasadena does something.
Oh, Roman's bookstore in Pasadena also does something similar. Great. Yeah. So it's a good idea. Okay. Maybe we are done. Well, thank you very much, everybody.